Welcome to Geopolitics Decanted. I'm Dmitri Alperovitch, chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator, a geopolitics think tank in Washington, D.C. This episode is the third installment of recordings from my trip to Ukraine earlier this month. I'm talking with Franz Stefan Gady, one of the premier military analysts in Europe, on a train ride to Kyiv about the future of European security architecture and whether Europe can shake off its enormous dependency on the United States and build sovereign capabilities that would allow America to focus more of its efforts on the Indo-Pacific. I hope you enjoy it. All right, let's chat about European security. The U.S. has been trying to pivot to the Indo-Pacific since the days of the Obama administration in 2011, always very unsuccessfully because other priorities keep pulling us back. One of them, of course, being the Middle East for the last decade, but now the war in Ukraine. But you are seeing now a shift in European security architectures and rethinking of their positions on military procurement. Most prominent of it has been Germany's position about the need to build the most capable military in Europe to be a pillar of European security, and at least announcing the spending of about 100 billion euros to reform the European military. How do you assess the efforts so far, where they're going? Is the strategy right? Is it actually being implemented? How do you see the European security evolving?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation and sitting here enjoying a nice cup of Ukrainian black tea while we are talking. I believe that, first of all, we're moving in the right direction when it comes to realizing that a new security architecture in Europe has actually emerged after February 24th, 2022. And there is a realization, particularly in countries like Germany, that military power is back on the scene. However, it's a hard and very long way that we still need to go in order to make it a reality. That is that, military means are actually seen once again as legitimate tools to advance German or European overall interests. And I think that's where we are at the moment. We've seen a couple of interesting efforts by the German governments to essentially engage with the German defense industry. You have issues like in any other countries pertaining to red tape, the financial situation. You mentioned already 100 billion euros is not going to be enough to really address the capability and capacity deficits in the German Bundeswehr.
And is that 100 billion actually being spent? There have been a lot of articles written about the announcement of 100 billion, but whether it's actually been allocated or not is a big question.
Yeah, so most of that money actually, as you rightly just said, has not been spent just yet. There are major procurement issues within the German military bureaucracy. There are a couple of institutions where the saying goes, this is where defense projects usually go to die. There's one instance, for example, where German helicopter pilots have been waiting for a decade to receive new helmets. They have major issues procuring a new assault rifle for their forces. There are lots and lots of examples where things are not really going according to plan. But I think this is, I would not say normal, but this is something that a lot of other countries have to deal with. If you look at the United States and the broken acquisition process there, for example, the major issue in Germany is what I said initially. It's really this discomfort with the concept of military power and the use of military power for good in international relations. I think that's a major, major problem. When we look into the future of warfare over the next 10 to 20 years, this will have major implications for the future German force structure, particularly when it comes to becoming more familiar, or at least more comfortable with the idea of autonomous weapon systems, loitering munitions, human-machine teaming, and so forth. All these concepts that have been going around in the United States, for example, when it comes to future warfighting. That's a debate that's not really happening in Germany right now, where you often there's a confusion, for example, between remotely piloted drones and loitering munitions, or more semi-autonomous or autonomous weapon systems. And I think Germany, if it wants to become really the leading military power again in Europe, has to become more comfortable with autonomy on the future battlefield. And I think that's something that I really see missing in the debate. Having said that, the German defense industry would have the potential to actually serve most of the German Bundeswehr's capability requirements.
It is one of the best military defense industries, right? I mean,
one of the largest.
But also, some of their weapon systems are some of the best in the world. The Leopard tanks, the IRIS-T air defense systems, their diesel submarines are considered some of the best in the world. They have a lot of capabilities to invent cutting-edge weapons platforms.
That is true. I think the first thing to understand, one needs to understand about the German defense industry, is that by and large they are a component supplier. So you see a lot of German components in a lot of weapon systems across the world, across the West. But they also have very excellent platforms. You mentioned a couple, particularly when it comes to ground vehicles, and you mentioned some of them, armored vehicles and so forth, main battle tanks. They're working on new armored vehicles. They are working on next generation battle tanks with a couple of other European partners. The main ground combat system, for example, is going to be a family of systems where you're going to have like manned platforms paired with unmanned platforms. But I think it's a good case in point of what I was trying to say earlier about this reluctance to engage with this concept of autonomy and what it means in military affairs. That is, when you look at, for example, this new main ground combat system that is the next generation main battle tank for the French army, the German Bundeswehr, if Germany is not willing to engage with autonomous platforms or lethal autonomous platforms, for example, then this concept of having a manned main battle tank that is sort of, for example, a command center from where you direct a number of autonomous ground vehicles that can actually do some of the more dangerous missions on the battlefields, whether it's mine clearing, whether it's actually direct fire support, indirect fire support, and so forth. You're probably going to develop these systems, and they are probably will not be used to the full technical potential, for example. And I think this is also where you probably will have cultural disagreements with countries such as France or the United Kingdom, where these concepts are more advanced, where people are more openly willing to engage, or at least be willing to integrate autonomous platforms into their force structure, into their warfighting concepts, and so forth. Of course, this is just one example of this larger AI-enabled evolution in military affairs. I particularly don't refer to it as a revolution in military affairs because I don't think that's going to be likely. It's going to be, an evolutionary introduction of AI-enabled capabilities in Western militaries, and I think here Germany could actually lose its cutting edge, or like its standing as one of the world's finest defense suppliers, because they have a lot to catch up on when it comes to AI and AI capabilities in warfighting. So I think we're, as I said, moving in a good direction, but it's by far not enough, and we need to be a lot faster, not just with capability requirements, also just capacity is going to be a problem, capacity, particularly when it comes to munition productions and so forth. And here the problem is that the German government, for example, has not really signed a lot of multi-year contracts with weapon suppliers, ammunition suppliers, like, for example, German defense contractor Rheinmetall. They have capacity to produce a couple of 100,000 heavy artillery shells a year, but this is really just a nominal capacity. The German government has not really signed long-term contracts with Rheinmetall to really expand capacity, and what they expect is a lot of pre-financing. So they expect German defense contractors to pre-finance expansion of additional production lines and so forth. And this is obviously not something that German defense companies are really willing to do. So you have a capability problem in the long term. You still have a capacity problem in the German defense industry. And this is just really one country, one example. And you really have these issues across the board, perhaps minus the whole cultural aspect that I was talking about regarding military power, autonomy, and so forth. That is really quite unique to Germany.
Of course, we have the same issues in the U.S. where long-term contracts are hard to come by, and as a result, defense industry is not investing in capacity, whether it's in naval capacity, shipyards, or ammunition production, and so forth. Let me ask you about the evolving nature of NATO. You obviously have Sweden now on the verge of joining. Hopefully, Turkey will acquiesce and provide the final approval. But they're a huge manufacturer of arms, variety of weapon systems, and along with Finland are a highly capable military, well-trained military. How do you see the integration of Finland and hopefully Sweden soon into NATO changing the European defense force structure?
I think when it comes to the land component of NATO, this is obviously going to massively increase combat capabilities for NATO overall. It's fundamentally changing the strategic picture for Russia as well, right, in the Baltics. My question is, can this really be sustainable with current defense budgets, right? Because what we're really seeing overall is a willingness by European countries to at least commit to increasing their defense budgets, but as I just said about Germany, you automatically hit a couple of practical limitations when it comes to expanding your military capacity and capability over the next couple of years, because we're just in Europe not ready for a full-scale, high-intensity conflict just in terms of our production capabilities. Again,
just in terms of volume, right? For it lasting well.
It's volume also, but it's also that we haven't invested in crucial technologies over the last couple of decades, where we became reliant on the United States. And I'm not saying that this is a particularly bad thing, but the idea that we really can, as Macron, likes to talk about, this idea of European autonomy or European
self-reliance,
sovereignty and stuff when it comes to defense issues. I just don't see that happening anytime soon. We will continue to need to rely on the United States as a security provider, and I don't think Finland and Sweden joining NATO is going to change that. I think it actually will, as a matter of fact, increase the demand for U.S. help in this matter, just because the United States, when it comes to the European security architecture, it doesn't just provide hard military power and capability, they also act as a political force integrator in a way. And I think it's more needed than ever at this stage. The United States is what keeps this European defense architecture glued together. I always compare it to the glue that is holding all of this together, because the truth is that there are a lot of divergent interests among a lot of the European countries when it comes to defense issues, and I think the United States is the one that can act as the primus inter pares on occasion, and then also make European countries prioritize their defense agendas. So I think Finland and Sweden joining NATO makes it more important for the United States to stay committed to European defense in the long run rather than the other way around. At least that's how I see it.
But it's one thing to have U.S. continue to provide a leadership role in NATO, herd the cats, try to integrate different capabilities in a coherent fashion, provide intelligence, resources, surveillance, reconnaissance, etc., airlift capacity, and so forth. And it's another thing to have significant U.S. forces continue to be stationed in Europe and adding on to it with permanent deployments in the Baltics and other places, and stationing equipment that we may need in the Indo-Pacific. So I guess the question that often comes up in D.C. discussions, particularly from the China hawk crowd that is very concerned about the looming potential of a battle with China, is at what point can we rely on the Europeans to take care of their own problems here in Europe, with us still being involved, not disappearing entirely, not hopefully withdrawing from NATO, but nevertheless not having significant forces and weapon systems, American weapon systems, being deployed in Europe?
Well, I mean, the main issue here is really enabling capabilities, right? Because obviously you can have a formidable U.S. Army presence in Europe and still pivot with most of your military forces to East Asia in the event of a conflict potentially emerging there. The major issue I see from a pure military perspective is critical enablers that are in really short supply, even in the United States military, the most powerful military in the world. And I think over the next couple of years, the next decade, unless European militaries are making some crucial investments in, for example, air refueling capabilities, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities, battle management systems, additional next generation fighter jets, fifth generation fighter jets, and so forth. Lots of other things that you would need to deter perhaps renewed aggression from the East. I think the United States will need to retain a sizable amount of enablers in Europe to just make European militaries work. Without those enablers and additional capabilities that Europe lacks, I think it's going to be extremely difficult to really maintain a credible deterrence posture vis-a-vis potential future adversaries such as Russia, for example, but even other countries. So to me, I don't think there can be an immediate shift, and I think Europeans don't realize what it really means should the United States engage in the war in East Asia, in Taiwan, because if this war is going to break out, and if there is not going to be a decision in the first couple of days or weeks, then you end up having a war of attrition in East Asia where you're going to be slowly grinding down each other's military capabilities. And here, even the United States is not very well positioned because the U.S. defense industry also currently, as it is structured, cannot really sustain a high-intensity military conflict over a prolonged amount of time. So eventually you would need to move those enabling capabilities in Europe to East Asia in the event that this war there goes on. And I think that's going to be a major problem, because once you cut some of these enablers in Europe, I think European military capability and capacity to conduct certain operations are going to be massively curtailed, and this of course will have immediate implications for deterrence. So I'm not trying to come up with dark scenarios here, but I could see that somebody could take advantage of that if the United States is engaged in a prolonged conflict with China, that certain actors could potentially take advantage of that in Europe, because they will find out that the emperor really has no clothes, that is, European military is over-reliant on the United States to provide enabling capabilities, might not be able to do much in the event of renewed aggression in Eastern Europe.
So, most conversations about European defense force structure is often centered around the big three countries, Germany, France, and the UK, even though UK is no longer part of the EU, still a critical component of NATO. And obviously these countries are huge countries with massive financial resources, but Europe is big, and you have other countries like Poland, for example, with huge populations, and you've seen them starting to also rethink their security structures after the Russian reinvasion of Ukraine. And you're seeing Poland invest massive amounts of money right now in procurement, for example, of Patriot defense missiles from the United States. You're seeing other procurements of F-35s across Eastern Europe. What do you make of the collective ability of other states in Eastern Europe, maybe in Southern Europe, Spain, Italy, and others, to compensate for where Germany and France perhaps are not moving sufficiently fast or in the right direction?
Well, military power is not just a function of how many platforms you have and what kind of artillery power, ground-based fires and so forth you can really put into the field in the event of conflicts. As I said, the key issue to me is not so much lack of firepower or lack of individual fighting platforms, although there is obviously, as I pointed out, a capability gap. For example, when it comes to next generation combat aircraft, long range air defense systems and so forth. To me, it's really the enablers that are missing, and that really will require at least half a decade to build up. But even there, the reliance on the United States is so strong that I don't really see that much movement to procure, for example, additional transportation capacity at a scale that is really going to be needed for future conflict with, for example, Russia. The same goes with long-range air defense systems, medium-range air defense systems, and then also the integration components that are needed. That is ISR capabilities that Europe can't really do on their own without U.S. support. I think, generally speaking, the issue here is political will, but it's also capacity, a capacity issue, as I pointed out. But I think political will is also a function of threat perceptions, right? And here you have a huge divergence in European countries that makes me not optimistic that we are really understanding that there has been a fundamental shift after February 24th, 2022. And I always point out February 24th, 2022 is not really the illness that we are trying to cure here. I think it's a symptom of a larger illness that has been going on for many, many years before. And I'm not even talking about 2014 with Russia invading Ukraine for the first time. I think there's been a fundamental power shift over the last couple of decades that sort of brings military power back on the table after this unipolar moment in the 1990s with the United States dominating all aspects of international relations, so to speak. And I think the problem here is that you still have countries such as France and Germany, some of the major military powers, that are not fundamentally, or they at least feel not threatened by countries such as Russia to a degree that it really demands a sense of urgency.
Well, they're far away, right?
They're far away.
So they know that if Russia is invading, there's Poland to get through. There's
the Baltics. There are other countries, and I think that's an issue. Then again, you have a country like the United Kingdom, which is deeply concerned about the rise of Russian military power. But even there's a lot of rhetoric about increasing defense budgets, new procurements and stuff. And the reality is that the UK defense budget has not substantially led to additional military, capabilities being procured, just because there are financial reasons for that, right? But financial budget, defense budgets are not rising to a degree that you can really embark on a massive buying spree, right? The same goes for Germany. The 100 billion that are often talked about, I mean, that amount already has been essentially all assigned to capabilities that should have been procured already 2 decades ago or so. So it's not substantially going to increase capability. And I think the most important aspect, what is usually missed when we talk about military power in Europe, but not just in Europe in general, is the human dimension, right? It's going to be extremely difficult to get people to enlist in those militaries in Europe, just as it is in the United States. But I think the problem in Europe is much, much bigger for societal reasons and, how the labor markets are structured.
Aging populations.
Aging population on top. But it's fundamentally, how do you attract like a 17, 18-year-old to join the military? I think, most of the European armed forces at this stage are volunteer forces, and that is a major, major issue. Even like with some of the remaining militaries where conscription is in place, you have massive, shortages of skilled laborers.
But hold on a second. You're not advocating for conscription militaries.
Oh,
right?
I'm not. I'm absolutely not advocating for conscription. I don't think that's really going to be tenable politically. It's also not something that I foresee to be like a great, a big component of any future war. Although the major issue and what we're seeing now here in Ukraine, we're just driving through the countryside here, riding through the countryside here on this train, is that what you need in a modern force structure is the ability to really reconstitute military power fairly quickly after a couple of days or weeks of heavy fighting. So you need a large reserve component, whether that large reserve component is manned or filled with conscripts or with reservists who voluntarily signed up, doesn't really matter, but you do need to incentivize people to join the military. Otherwise, you're a spent force after a couple of days of heavy fighting. So I'm not for conscription. I think it's not something that is really going to solve any of the immediate problems, but brings me back to my initial comment about, for example, Germany and Germany's relation to military power and lethal autonomous systems. One obvious solution over the next 10 to 20 years would be increased human-machine teaming to act as a force multiplier on the battlefield. I know the technology is not there just yet, but you could potentially come up with new operational concepts, military doctrine in the future, force structure and so forth, where you can actually, with less people, achieve higher effects on the battle space by just fielding a lot more autonomous platforms, unmanned, uncrewed platforms, whatnot. And I think this is something where Europe as a whole is lagging behind other countries such as the United States, but also potential future adversaries such as Russia or competitors such as China. At least that's, I think, something that needs to be pointed out here. Yeah.
So you spend a lot of time thinking about future warfare, future design weapon systems. Let me ask you a more strategic question. Weapon systems get more and more complex and more expensive over time, as a general rule. And as a result, if the budgets can't keep up with that level of expense, you tend to procure less and less of them, right? So, for example, as militaries are migrating from the F-16s to the F-35s, it's not a one-to-one typically transition because the F-35 costs a lot more. And the key question is, are we getting enough return on investment for that additional expense? Yes, the F-35 is a highly capable jet, much more capable than the F-16, but given that you can't procure it in as many numbers, is that additional qualitative advantage compensated enough for the decrease in quantity? And not just about the F-35, but really all these weapon systems. Should we be rethinking this move towards more and more complex systems that, by the way, require a lot more training, a lot more time from the professional militaries, and would potentially be a problem with the reserve force or certainly conscripts to operate? And should we be thinking more volume of cheaper, simpler systems, particularly if future wars might be attritional wars?
Well, the likelihood that any future great power war is going to be dominated by attrition is probably very, very, very high. So I do think we need to take that into account in any of our discussions pertaining to future force structure. To answer your question, I think what we need is a hybrid force structure, where we have a lot of so-called attritable platforms paired with more exquisite or more multi-purpose platforms such as the F-35 that you mentioned. And this is really where operational concepts are coming in, where we need to be innovative. How do we integrate these different capabilities? And I don't think it's an either-or answer. I think it's going to be both. At one point, any sort of quantity is going to become quality of its own, right? So I think the question is, what is really the tipping point where we have a certain amount of multi-purpose platforms that are, where we cannot really afford to lose a lot of them, and that then in turn is going to massively reduce our, combat potential in any future conflict vis-a-vis, what can we really achieve with some of those more attritable platforms without actually those larger multi-purpose platforms acting as an enabler, so to speak. And I think the question is, at the end of the day, how do you effectively integrate attritable with more multi-purpose platforms? That to me seems to be the key to unlocking future military power.
And do you see anyone, whether it's the United States or Europe, thinking about it that way?
Yes, I think there's a big effort in the United States now, and I think they're again leading the charge, at least in the West, and NATO thinking through these issues and really thinking about human-machine teaming, integrating attritable platforms with multi-purpose platforms, that is, unmanned drones with more, next generation combat capabilities such as the F-35 and so forth.
But even, let me just push back, because even these unmanned drones are incredibly expensive relatively compared to the drones that the Ukrainians are using, these FPV drones that they build for $1,000, $2,000. There's no equivalent of that in the United States. Everything is counted in the millions, if not tens of millions. So are we thinking about it in the right way in terms of we need tens of thousands of these things because we're going to be losing them by the hundreds every single week, if not at an even higher rate? And if each one costs millions of dollars, that's not sustainable.
So there are a couple of projects that are already underway where they're specifically trying to address this issue. And there are also some very innovative approaches that I've seen. Last time I was in DC, I talked to folks about this, where you actually just rely on commercial off-the-shelf products for certain operations, particularly when it comes to ground operations, where you can effectively integrate or create new kill chains, that is linking sensors and shooters with commercial off-the-shelf products, where you don't really care about losing a couple of dozens a day or whatever, when it comes to these drones that are acting as ISR platforms essentially for your artillery batteries and so forth, or other ground-based fires.
And do you think we're going to be visiting and talking to lots of people here this week in Ukraine about how they're integrating and building those capabilities? Do you think that there's a lot we could learn from the Ukrainians on this front?
I'm sure there's certain lessons that we can learn from the Ukrainians. At the same time, we can also learn some of the more negative lessons that the Ukrainians had to learn the hard way from fielding a lot of commercial off-the-shelf products, just in terms of scalability. Bottom-up approach of innovation is always obviously a good thing in the business industry, but it reaches its natural limits when it comes to military force structure, where you have a problem of interoperability at a certain stage. If you, as a brigade or as a battalion, try to come up with a new way of managing the battlefield, but your unit next to you is actually not capable of receiving that data and so forth. So I think, there are a couple of good lessons to be learned here, but I would be extremely cautious in extrapolating too many lessons and try to apply them one-on-one to Western militaries here.
Well, Franz Stefan Gady, always a pleasure.
Thank you very much.